Um, Isabel, I should start by saying that many of the issues which I, as an economist, can cover have been covered initially by Surajit and Prabhat and partly now by Jyoti. So I'll try not to be repetitive as far as possible, but some of these issues would be coming up again. Uh, Essentially, we know that there are when we look at it from this kind of through this kind of a lens, there are three questions. One is, what was the intensity of the crisis, or is the intensity of the crisis, which the country experienced because partly of the pandemic itself, but more importantly because of the state response to the pandemic. The second is that what exactly was that state response, which a lot of people have spoken about. And the third, of course, is that given this, what really is the scenario for the near future, for the coming financial year and the year after that. Now, the official response has been underlined by everybody is that things are really looking good because of the fact that we've gone through a V-shaped recovery. But as we know that this V-shaped recovery really is not even putting India back onto the trajectory on which it would have been if we didn't go through the pandemic. But of course, in any case, it was not going to be on that trajectory because towards the sort of third and fourth quarters of 2019, the economy had already started going down, starting from about 4 or 5 quarters before that, was going down into a recession. It was the rates of growth, even of the kind of numbers which come out of the 2012 series, were pointing to a significant deceleration in growth and a tendency towards recession. And of course, people were speaking about the fact that, as was widely reported, from biscuits to cars, you know, the system was faced with the demand shortages, and therefore the possibility of a recession was substantial. But if we go earlier than that, we really are saying that this so-called V-shaped recovery is going to keep us, significantly short of what would have been the output. The level of output if we go back to the period before the turnaround or the downturn began. Okay, uh, so the issue is. What exactly was the impact of that in terms of where we were likely to go? We know from the quarterly labor force surveys, which is now available for the period from April to June as well, that an unemployment rate, current weekly status, which is about 9% plus in the first of the quarters of the calendar year, had gone up to close to 21%. And current weekly status is basically asking a person whether there was at least 1 hour in the reference period of the previous week in which he or she had some employment. So you're really talking about a basic minimum level of employment. And in essence, what you're saying is that 1 out of 5 people who was in the labor force seems to have been unable to get even that much of an unemployment, which obviously is going to have devastating effects, not just then, but obviously in terms of the ability to come back to a kind of employment you might have had, which itself, given the predominance of precarious employment in the country, the informality of the workforce, etc., we know is not the best. But the likelihood from reports, for example, the Delhi survey and so on and so forth, which has been reported over the last few days, points to the fact that even those who are coming back to work are really not coming back to work to jobs which would even give them what they were getting earlier. So you're really going to see a situation where, in terms of some kind of a market at the bottom of the pyramid, that's going to be considerably depressed. And as Prabhat pointed out, things are going to be even worse because of the fact that during this period of time, there's been a considerable accumulation. People had to survive. Many of them don't have savings. There's no social protection. So they must have essentially, as reports indicate, anecdotal sort of reports indicate, they have got indebted in considerable measure. And given that burden of debt, you're going to have to actually have a situation in which you're going to be allocating part of even that limited income, if you get it by coming back into the workforce, is going to be allocated to repay your debt. And therefore, on the consumption side, we're going to have a situation which is quite depressed. And as far as investment is concerned, if you take the second advanced estimate, the projection is, it's likely possibly to be worse. The projection is that in this financial year, that is 2021, gross capital, fixed capital formation in the country would have gone down by, in real terms, by about 12%, compared to an increase of about 6% we had in the previous year. So investment is also going to be significantly down, consumption is down, and therefore what we should expect is that the effects of this, multiplier effects and other, the effects on future employment, etc., would be such as that, as the likelihood of us even getting back to a situation where we replicate the recession-bound economy's trajectory, uh, the prior to pandemic recession-bound economy, and to get back even to that level is going to be is most unlikely. So in a growth sense, in an employment sense, in the sense of um, access to earnings, livelihoods, etc. As many have pointed out, things are really bad, and that is going to influence what's going to happen. So the source of this optimism is unclear. This optimism that actually, or things are actually turning out to be very good. That we've seen this V-shaped recovery, and this V-shaped recovery is going to now, actually become some kind of a J-shaped recovery, and we're going to keep growing and getting back or exceeding where we're likely to be, as the chief economic advisor tended to point out when he was presenting the economic survey. Now, the thing is, that this obviously is as bad as it is because of the fact that has been pointed out by all who refer to the issue, that because of the fact that the government's response in terms of offering a fiscal stimulus, using a part of that stimulus to make transfers to people to sustain consumption, to actually provide adequate guarantees so that credit could be provided to small and medium firms for them to survive till the effects of the pandemic go, so that they are still afloat at the end of the pandemic and can return to business. That in all of these senses, even in terms of the guarantees which are given, and the partial guarantees which are given, they were so measly that really we are in a situation where we have a government which looked at in terms of what it has done relative to GDP, 1.5% maybe, um, and in terms of relative comparisons with many other developing countries, and of course the developed countries, the sort of real fiscal stimulus in terms of actual spend was meager, and there was some kind of pressure on the central bank to try and keep interest rates low and push liquidity into the system, in the hope that that would somehow get the economy moving again, which of course is not really happening. Now the thing is, when we ask the question, why didn't the government do what other governments did, what was logically the thing to do, particularly given the intensity of the crisis, and given the fact that if you really look at it as a number, the government has gone way beyond what was its so-called glide path to 3% of fiscal deficit to GDP ratio, because we are talking about levels of 9%. Even next year, it's going to be 6.8%, and so on. So it's not that they were necessarily so afraid of not putting out a number, because the world over, the opinion was changing that really, given the intensity of this crisis, its widespread nature, you've got to drop orthodoxies which emphasize monetary policy as being the principal way of addressing a crisis, and take a major proactive fiscal step. And therefore, I do think uh, only the fear of finance, in some sense, cannot explain the sort of the adherence to some kind of austerity on these kinds of issues. And this is also important because of the fact that, it's not merely acts of commission, that is not spending. That actually not going in for proactive fiscal policies, etc., of that kind. But there's one. Supposing we take the period, in September last year. I mean, not last year, year before last, in September 2019, when the recession was clear, we all would recall that the finance minister, when under pressure to provide a stimulus from big business, which was particularly the automobile industry and so on, decided that the best stimulus she can provide in the context of a what was a demand constrained system, compressed demand leading to recession, decided to actually offer a huge corporate tax concession. The effective corporate tax rate was brought down from about 34.6% or so to about 25.3%. That was a huge, almost 10 percentage point decline. I mean, a reduction in the effective tax rate. Um, the benefit which was provided for new companies which were setting themselves up was even larger. And in essence, therefore, the estimate which was provided by the finance minister at that point of time was that she was foregoing revenue to the tune of about 1.45 lakh crore over a full financial year in order to actually incentivize investment by the private sector. And this was, of course, absurd. It was completely absurd because of the fact that when you're in the midst of a recession, obviously the idea is not to provide a tax concession, but it's to spend. And if you're going to spend, it's better to retain the revenues and undertake spending rather than forego revenues in the hope that because of the incentive that provides, uh, firms which actually don't see a market out there are still going to expand capacity and undertake investment, which obviously didn't happen as the numbers show. Now, now the thing is that the first simplest thing to do when confronted with the recession would have been for the government then to decide that listen, let's at least put this on hold. I mean, you could have said that at that point of time when we did it, the pandemic hadn't yet struck. We then thought that this was a way of addressing the recession, but now that the pandemic has struck and that we need money to to address the health emergency, to provide transfers to people who are adversely affected, to spend in order to try and stimulate a recovery, etc. That for these reasons we need additional revenue, so we're going to put this on hold and we'll come back to it later. Or it could have said, listen, we are taking this concession back because it was not something which was being demanded at that point of time, even by big business. Big business was basically trying to say, please spend because we are not able to sell the goods that we're producing and we are stuck with large inventories. Okay. Now, therefore, so the first thing is you choose not to do that. But simultaneously, we know that in March and in May, the government decides to hugely hike its duties on petrol and diesel, which of course is a big controversy over the last few months and particularly recently. We know that this is a tactic which has been adopted by the NDA government or the Modi government ever since it came to power in 2014. And that in the period since then, we've actually seen a huge increase in multiple steps over the years. But two of those steps take place when? One in March 2020, when obviously the idea was to try and get some additional money, even to finance the meager sort of whatever Atmanirbhar package or something you're going to announce. And the second was in May, when we were deep into the crisis which was being created, and you're actually putting a significant, imposing a significant excise duty, increase in excise duty on commodities which are universal intermediates and therefore going to enter into the production of almost directly or indirectly into almost all commodities and services, and therefore not basically generate inflation, but force savings out of people who don't even have incomes to a certain extent in certain segments of the population. Okay. It's another thing that, of course, because of the lockdown, etc., for some period of time, the demand for petrol and diesel went down. But despite that, you actually see the government getting a huge increase in revenues. Now, if you look at the revenues which were got, we know that between 2014 and 15 and 2020-21, the total revenues to the center from excise duties on petroleum, I mean, on diesel, petrol, and natural gas went up from something like 75,000 crores to 2.95 lakh crores, so it's almost 3 lakh crores. So there's this huge amount of money which has actually been savings forced out of the population at large, an extremely regressive tax, and using it to undertake expenditures. Okay. So it's not that this government was not capable, even in the middle of the pandemic, of thinking of ways where it can raise resources. But one way of raising those resources was not of actually saying that, listen, we gave a tax concession which we shouldn't have given, and we're going to take it back, or we're at least going to put it on hold. Rather, you actually go and impose a regressive tax to get additional amount of money when already you've been in multiple stages imposing this kind of a tax and getting those resources. Now, what exactly was done with this money? Of course, part of the money went to compensate for the loss of corporate tax revenues. Uh, if there'd be no buoyancy in corporate taxes, there'd be no increase, then, as I said, the estimate was that you lose about 1.45 lakh crores. In practice, of course, the fall in corporate tax revenues relative to the revised estimate of the previous year, if that is right, was in the range of about of the revised estimate relative to the estimate for the actual estimate for the previous year was about 59,000 crores. So what you have lost there is 59,000 crores. What did you get? Largely from the taxes on petroleum and diesel. You got a little more than about 1 lakh 1,000 crores is what you got in terms of an increase in excise duty revenues to the center in the year 2021. So basically, what's happening is you've covered virtually most of the loss that you've incurred. You, in fact, because you would have you expected to lose 1.45 lakh crores, and you got it through this mechanism of an increase in excise revenues, which comes from this extremely regressive tax. And if we take the increase in expenditure, which occurred between 2019-20 and 2021, the total expenditure of the central government as reported in the revised estimate, if they are to be trusted, because they are projections after all, and we know that those projections are very often just dreamed up before the presentation. But even with those numbers, more than 2/5, about 41% of the total increase in expenditure is coming out of the increase in excise duty revenues which the government is getting, which largely, almost completely comes from the increase in revenues which you're getting from these taxes on oil and petroleum. So in essence, there is that it's not austerity down the line. You are wanting to mobilize some resources, but you're not going to mobilize the resources in a way which is progressive. It's an extremely inequalizing structure of taxation that you put in place in a year in which the impact of the crisis is extremely severe, and the impact of that crisis on those at the bottom of the pyramid has been devastating. Okay, now the thing is what did the government do with these revenues? Okay, you can say that finally it could have spent more by going in for an even higher fiscal deficit to GDP ratio. In any case, a given fiscal deficit number does not mean a similar fiscal stimulus if it is occurring in a context in which revenues are falling, and revenues on the corporate tax side and of course on the side of GST, etc., are falling. Okay, so you're not even talking about those fiscal deficit numbers really being meaningful relative. I mean, when comparing it to a normal year in terms of size, because that fiscal deficit number is sitting on top of a fall in the tax to GDP ratio because of what has been happening now, or the size of tax at least. Now the thing is, that we know that all of this money which comes from these cesses and these duties finally did not go to sustain expenditures of a kind which will provide transfers to those worst affected, to actually spend adequately on providing protection to frontline workers, to providing some kind of support to small businesses and the informal sector, etc. What you had is an attempt to try and portray, by shifting much of these revenues, first, a large chunk of the money which came in the form of cess, because you want to impose it in the form of cess. And of course, in the case, since petrol is not, petroleum products are not as yet under GST, those excise duties also, but they're shareable. So you basically say that I'll try to take as much as possible out of cess. And this cess, which has been increased over a period of time, and which was initially supposed to be a cess collected in order to fund investment in the highways. So the whole idea is that you tax fuel used for transportation, and you use that money by putting it into a central, road fund, okay, and use it to build highways. Now, we know that about 3 years back or so, the government converted the Central Road Fund into the Central Road and Infrastructure Fund. It then decided to move the Central Road and Infrastructure Fund out of the Ministry of Highways to the Department of Economic Affairs of the Ministry of Finance, and declared, of course, that we can use this for anything. So you can use this for expenditure, social expenditure, saying that, listen, I've decided to use it for this purpose because you removed that tag attached to that fund. Now, what the government did, of course, was use part of this money to show that it's spending on some infrastructure, the railways, highways, etc. But more importantly, what it did was use a significant part of this to finance what it called health and well-being expenditures, of which, of course, most of it was really well-being, as was pointed out by Indranil. And for that also you took it, but you didn't take any of these monies that you had mobilized to actually do things of a kind which would have made difference to the population, which is so badly affected by the pandemic. So I do think that, that to interpret the austerity purely as being a way in which the government is appeasing whatever, these were raised, credit rating agencies, finance capital, and so on. It is true that this government wants to appease those sections, and goes out of its way, and besides, of course, being over friendly with a few corporate groups. But the point is, this kind of a fiscal strategy actually suggests that it goes beyond that. It could have actually done, because it could, I mean, if it had basically said, I'm putting on hold my corporate tax concession, that's not going to immediately have triggered a flight out. People say, yeah, that's true. You obviously showed intent, but you now are stuck with the problem, so you're going to postpone it and maybe come back to it. You needn't have, done the kind of thing which you did in terms of a regressive taxation in point of time when people who are hit by a crisis are going to actually bear the burden of that kind of a tax, because it falls on all commodities. You could have actually decided to borrow and spend, even borrow from the central bank. So it also reflects a kind of attitude that in some sense, people can be persuaded to sacrifice and fend for themselves. They were sort of persuaded to do that for odd goals at the time of demonetization, which of course could not be realized. They were now implicitly being called upon, so that whatever the government did, in fact, worsens the condition, increases the inequality which gets accentuated by the differential impact of the crisis across different sections of the population, and and then just lets them, to their own devices, leaves them to their own devices. Okay. Now, the only problem I think it faced, of course, is that it had declared, when it's from a level of about 50,000 crores, when it decided that it was going to mobilize in the financial year 2019-20, something like 210,000 or 210,000 crores from sale of public assets, from disinvestment and privatization. It obviously couldn't do that. The first 10 months, the official figures are 24,000. The budget predicts 32,000. That's way below 210,000. So obviously, it's hope that it would be able to do that, and maybe, besides building a new parliament, etc., would also go and have some mega projects in different parts of the country. That obviously didn't work. But you can see that that is the direction in which the system is moving, that you maintain otherwise an extremely regressive tax structure, which doesn't mobilize for you adequate resources, and use essentially monetization of assets and sale of public equity, now openly declared as privatization, as ways over the next few years to sort of claim that you're going to undertake these expenditures. So there is no, even despite the crisis, there is no real real deep concern on addressing the crisis, whether it as a health emergency or as an economic crisis. But really, it is of continuing to pursue an agenda of having a particular kind of spending, particular kind of partners from the corporate sector, and particular ways of financing it, which is regressive taxation, as well as relying on this expected massive sale. Of course, the budget has been a little less ambitious than last year. They've said 175,000 crores, but they've left it open because they've said, listen, we are going to do this with two banks besides IDBI. We're going to do it with the LIC. We're going to monetize as much assets. So first, we have to go and check out what assets can be monetized. So you're basically declaring that I'm going to try and get a bunch of money because I have to sell past assets to create new assets in the infrastructural area. So it's really continuing with that kind of a strategy, which of course thus far has been extremely unsuccessful, rather than saying that because I don't have the courage vis-a-vis finance or whatever it is to do what it takes is what I'm not doing it. They're not even saying that. They're saying we're going to do a set of things, but we are not going to do a set of things which actually is going to address the crisis which this economy is going to be in for perhaps the coming few years. I think I'll stop there. Thanks.